In October 1992, a 70-year-old woman from Mill Bay, British Columbia, and her car vanished without a trace. Janet Margaret Stanforth Ferris was born in 1922. She later married Walter Earl Ferris, a man with whom she built a life. Their marriage lasted many years until Walter's death in 1984. His death left Janet a widow. Yet she continued on keeping her role as a mother and adapting to the challenges of life without her husband by her side. Janet and Walter had a son who also lived in Mill Bay, British Columbia. The connection with her son kept her life grounded in many ways, keeping her tied to her family and community. On October 1, 1992, Janet left her home planning to travel to Alberta for a wedding. It was meant to be a normal trip, one she started alone, but she would never return. When she failed to come back as expected, her family members quickly got concerned. What began as worry soon turned into fear when there was still no sign of her. Her family, realizing how serious her disappearance was, reported her missing to the police. A missing person report was filed and the authorities took immediate steps to begin tracing her movements. The initial goal was clear: to figure out where Janet could have gone and what might have happened during her journey. Through their investigation, the police were able to piece together parts of her travel route. They confirmed that Janet had been driving by herself to Alberta. Along the way, she had stopped to spend the night at her sister's home in White Rock. The following day, she continued her trip, making a recorded purchase for gas at the Tappan Esso station, located east of Salmon Arm. After that purchase, Janet vanished. Neither she nor her vehicle were ever seen again. It was as though she had disappeared without a trace, leaving the investigators with only the faint outline of her last known movements. The sudden loss of contact made the situation even more upsetting for her family, who hoped each day for any word of her whereabouts. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched a huge search effort. Highway patrols were done hoping to find some sign of her car or her presence along the route. Aerial searches were done using helicopters to scan large stretches of road and land. Search and rescue volunteers along with family members joined in, searching through roadways and surrounding areas where Janet might have been. Despite these efforts, no major lead ever came up. The days turned into weeks, and the investigation offered no breakthrough and eventually went cold. On August 24, 2019, nearly 3 decades after Janet's disappearance, her vehicle was finally recovered from Griffin Lake in British Columbia. The finding was made possible by a 13-year-old boy named Max Warnaka. While spending time at Griffin Lake, Max and his mother noticed what appeared to be the outline of a vehicle underwater just off the shore. The sight was unusual and immediately got their attention. Their curiosity would soon uncover the key to Janet's case. Armed with a GoPro camera, Max decided to take a closer look. He dove into the lake, moving underwater to capture video footage of the object. The recording clearly showed the shape of an overturned car resting beneath the water's surface. His quick thinking and determination provided real proof that something significant had been hidden in Griffin Lake for years. The first guess was that the underwater car might have been connected to a 2009 accident known to have happened in the area. This theory seemed possible at first glance given how much time had passed and the lack of immediate details. However, questions came up as more people looked at the situation more closely. An off-duty officer from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police saw the discovery and suggested that the vehicle could be tied to an older case. This suggestion changed the focus of the investigation and caused further action. It was no longer just a curious find. It might finally solve a mystery that had remained unsolved for decades. A professional dive team was brought in to confirm the car's identity. Divers carefully recovered the license plate from the underwater vehicle, and once it was examined, the truth was revealed. The plate matched Janet's missing car, definitely tying the discovery at Griffin Lake to her disappearance in 1992. When the vehicle was finally pulled from Griffin Lake, the investigators confirmed that Janet's body was still inside. The sad discovery closed a chapter that had been open for 27 years. While it was heartbreaking to find her in such circumstances, the recovery provided long-awaited answers for those who had lived with uncertainty for decades. The authorities quickly determined that her death was not considered suspicious. Instead, the evidence suggested a tragic accident. The investigators guessed that Janet may have lost control of her vehicle while driving along the lake road. It was possible that she had swerved to avoid hitting an animal or another obstacle, which may have caused her to veer off the road and into the water. Her son, George Ferris, spoke about the family's reaction to the discovery. After so many years of unanswered questions, he expressed a sense of relief at finally knowing what had happened. Although the loss was still deeply painful, the clarity of the discovery offered some peace. The uncertainty had been lifted, and with it came some degree of closure. Janet's remains were respectfully recovered, and arrangements were made for her cremation. Plans were set for her to be buried alongside her husband Walter Earl Ferris in Mill Bay. The reunion of her remains with her late husband symbolized the closing of a long and painful separation, both for Janet and for the family who had waited so long for this outcome. George explained that the family had long believed Janet's disappearance was most likely the result of a car accident during her journey to the wedding. Theories within the family included the possibility of a medical emergency, the chance she may have fallen asleep behind the wheel, or the likelihood she had swerved to avoid an animal or sudden obstacle. These possibilities had remained in their minds for years, unanswered until the car's discovery. Above all, George emphasized that the worst part of the whole thing had been the uncertainty of not knowing. In June 1995, a violent crash in Emporia, Virginia, claimed the lives of two young men. One was identified quickly, but the passenger was a complete mystery for decades. On June 26, 1995, 21-year-old Michael Hager gave another young man a ride after a Grateful Dead concert. That day, the two young men shared the road as they traveled through Virginia. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, tragedy struck when the vehicle they were in crashed into a pair of trees in Emporia, Virginia. The collision was devastating and claimed both of their lives. They were not wearing seat belts. The authorities quickly identified the driver as Michael, but the passenger posed a far greater challenge. He carried no ID and no one at the scene knew who he was. Without a name, the passenger became known only by a nickname created from the circumstances of his death, Grateful Doe. In the days and years that followed, his case became one of the most widely discussed examples of an unknown accident victim. Several belongings found with him were kept as potential clues. Among them were two ticket stubs from the concerts held at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C. on June 24 and June 25, 1995. Another significant discovery was a handwritten note. It was addressed to Jason and signed by two people identified as Caroline O. and Caroline T. The note included a phone number with a 914 area code, but the full contact details were incomplete. Despite efforts to trace it, the investigators were unable to link the number to anyone connected to the case, and the identities of the two Carolines remain unknown. In addition to the note and concert stubs, the investigators documented several personal details that stood out. He had a homemade star tattoo inked onto his left arm, a beaded necklace, and other distinctive possessions that reflected his lifestyle. Unfortunately, despite the detectives' best efforts, the case went cold. In January 2015, after 2 decades, the story of Grateful Doe took an unexpected turn from across the globe. A Reddit user in Queensland, Australia, stumbled upon the case while researching unsolved mysteries. Fascinated by the details, the user began gathering more information and later shared it on Imgur. The post included specifics such as the cause of death, the clothing the man had been wearing, the items found with him, and several of the facial reconstructions that had been created over the years. The Reddit user's intention was simple: to spread the information hoping that someone might recognize the unidentified young man. That effort soon proved successful. A message arrived from someone who had seen the reconstruction and believed he recognized the victim. He explained that the face looked strikingly similar to one of his old roommates from Illinois, a young man he remembered by the name of Jason. He described him as a free-spirited hippie surfer type, which matched the image long associated with Grateful Doe. Not long after this recognition, the case began to grow in public attention. The story of Grateful Doe spread quickly, catching the interest of mainstream media outlets. Soon, it went viral across social media platforms, reaching a much wider audience than ever before. It was through this growing wave of exposure that the case finally reached someone very close to the truth. On Facebook, a woman named Margareta Evans came across the photos and reconstructions. To her, the young man in the images was immediately recognizable. She identified him as her son, Jason Callahan, who had disappeared years earlier. Determined to confirm what she already knew in her heart, the authorities arranged for a DNA test in early 2015. The results confirmed the match. Grateful Doe was indeed Jason Patrick Callahan. Jason was born on April 18, 1976. During his late teenage years, Jason was living in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. A key part of Jason's life was his passion for music. He was a devoted fan of the American rock band, the Grateful Dead, whose following spanned generations and created an entire culture of community, freedom, and travel. Jason's admiration for the band went beyond casual interest. It became an important part of who he was, shaping his lifestyle and the choices that would eventually change the course of his life. In June 1995, when he was just 19 years old, Jason made the decision to leave his home and follow them on their tour that summer. The band's concerts were more than shows. They were gatherings where fans came together in a traveling community, going from city to city in pursuit of music and belonging. Yet what Jason could not have known was that this decision, taken with excitement and hope, would place him on a path toward danger. The investigators reflected on the case and explained why Jason had gone so long without being identified. A detective noted that Jason's mother had tried to report him missing, but because of the traveling lifestyle associated with the community, she was unsure of which police department should handle the report. As the years passed without word from him, Jason's family came to believe that he had simply chosen to live his life elsewhere. When the truth finally came out, it was met with mixed emotions. While the identification brought long-awaited closure, the detective admitted to a lingering sadness. He expressed that Jason's case might have been solved much sooner if the proper missing person report had been filed and directed correctly. At the same time, he acknowledged the power of social media in finally solving the mystery. After 2 decades, Jason Callahan had his name restored, and while the story carried a sad weight, the most important fact remained: Grateful Doe was no longer unknown. In December 1983, a young mother from Richmond, California, went missing. DNA analysis would link the criminal to the crime decades later. Marcia Carter was born in 1958. By the time she reached the age of 25, she was already carrying great responsibilities on her shoulders. Marcia was a single mother raising 4 children on her own. While focusing on her role as a mother, Marcia was also involved in a turbulent personal relationship. She had been in an on-and-off relationship with a man named Daryl Smothers. The connection between them was far from steady, marked by cycles of closeness and distance. Despite the instability, their relationship remained a recurring part of Marcia's life. On the morning of December 7, 1983, Marcia's 3 older sons, whose ages ranged from about 7 to 11 years old, entered their mother's bedroom. What they saw was alarming and confusing. Blood was visible on the mattress, but Marcia herself was nowhere to be found. The absence of their mother immediately set off a wave of fear for the children who were left without any explanation for the troubling scene. Inside the same room, the boys made another unsettling discovery. Their infant brother, only about 10 months old at the time, was found hiding beneath the bed. The baby's presence in such a vulnerable position only added to the distress of the moment. Faced with fear and uncertainty, the children quickly sought help, running to a neighbor's house to raise alarm about what they had witnessed. The authorities responded quickly once the call for help was made. The police officers arrived at Marcia's home and immediately began an investigation into her disappearance. They examined the disturbing evidence inside the bedroom, carefully noting the blood on the mattress and the condition of the home. Their immediate priority was to determine what had happened to Marcia and to ensure the safety of her children. As the search expanded, the police worked tirelessly to find any clue that might reveal Marcia's whereabouts. Interviews, evidence collection, and local searches were conducted hoping to uncover answers. Despite their efforts, Marcia remained missing in those first crucial days. Her disappearance left her children, her community, and the investigators with more questions than answers. It was not until 10 days later that a devastating discovery was made. Marcia's body was found inside the trunk of her own car, which had been abandoned and parked in West Sacramento. The grim discovery confirmed the worst fears of both her family and the authorities. Marcia had been the victim of a violent and tragic death. Even with the recovery of her body, the investigation struggled to move forward. The police tried to understand how Marcia ended up in the trunk of her vehicle, but solid leads failed to come up. Without clear evidence pointing to a suspect or a motive, the case lost momentum and ultimately went cold. Starting in 2008, 25 years after the case was opened, the authorities decided to take another look at Marcia's case. Biological samples and DNA evidence that had originally been collected in 1983 were carefully looked at again, with the hope that modern testing could reveal what had once gone undetected. For years, the case had remained unsolved, though the investigators had long had suspicions about Marcia's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Darrell L. Smothers. Smothers was a wealthy man who by that time had been left wheelchair-bound after a car crash in 1989. His connection to Marcia and the troubled nature of their relationship placed him in the spotlight of suspicion, but it was not until the DNA reanalysis that the investigators believed that they had a breakthrough. The new testing revealed a link between Smothers and the crime. DNA evidence discovered in Marcia's residence tied him directly to the case. With this connection, the prosecutors moved forward, and in 2016, a grand jury formally charged Darrell Smothers for killing Marcia. The case finally went to trial on September 20, 2018. The prosecutors presented their evidence to the jury, including the crucial DNA samples that had been identified on Marcia's clothing and within her home. After decades of uncertainty, the courtroom became the stage for long-awaited answers about what had happened to Marcia. By the end of the trial, the jury reached a decisive conclusion. In September 2018, Smothers was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years to life. For many, the verdict seemed to deliver justice after so many years of unanswered questions. However, the resolution would prove to be far from final. In 2021, the First District Appeals Court overturned Smothers' conviction, dramatically changing the course of the case once again. The court pointed to serious errors made by Smothers' defense attorney, particularly in handling the complexities of the DNA evidence. Adding to the shock was an unexpected twist. DNA found under Marcia's fingernails was matched to a man named Kevin Sennett who lived in Wisconsin and had no known connection to Marcia or the events in California. Sennett's name was kept from the jury during the 2018 trial. It is unclear whether the Contra Costa District Attorney will move to retry the case. In October 1983, the body of a 23-year-old man was discovered in Spalding County, Georgia, mutilated with an X carved into his stomach. Decades later, a cold case investigator reopened the file, uncovering old secrets through new witness testimony. Timothy Coggins was born in 1960 and spent his childhood in Spalding County, Georgia. He grew up in a large, close-knit family surrounded not only by his siblings, but also by cousins who were like brothers and sisters to him. He was one of 8 children in the household with 3 brothers and 4 sisters. Timothy was raised by his mother Viola Dorsey and his stepfather Robert Dorsey. Music and dancing were among Timothy's greatest joys. He was known for enjoying life, often finding expression through rhythm and movement. For work, Timothy often joined his stepfather in practical trades. He painted, laid bricks, and handled carpentry and plumbing, skills he learned directly from Robert. Timothy also lived in ways that set him apart from many around him. In a community where racial divisions were strongly felt, he socialized openly across racial lines. Many of his friends were white, and he even dated white women. He moved through these interactions without fully realizing the risks they carried in that era and place. Timothy did not know the danger that was waiting ahead of him. In October 1983, tragedy struck when 23-year-old Timothy's life was taken. His body was discovered in a condition that showed the violence he endured. He had been stabbed more than 30 times, and the investigators noted a deliberate mutilation. An X had been carved into his stomach, a mark resembling the symbol of the Confederate flag. The brutality of the wounds revealed the deep hatred behind the attack. Further details of the crime painted an even more disturbing picture. Evidence showed that Timothy had been dragged behind a truck before his body was abandoned. His remains were left beneath a large oak tree, a tree that carried its own dark history in the area and was locally known as the Hanging Tree. This location added a chilling weight to the crime. Law enforcement would later conclude that the crime was racially motivated. In the social climate of the time, Timothy's openness in crossing racial boundaries became a dangerous point of conflict. His associations, particularly his willingness to date white women, drew the anger of those who tried to enforce segregation through fear and violence. The investigators determined that one of the triggers for the attack was his relationship with a white woman. In the eyes of the suspects, his social choices were considered unacceptable. This, coupled with his broader friendships across racial lines, marked him as a target. His murder served as a grim warning meant to create fear in the black community. Despite the savagery of the crime and the clues surrounding it, the case would remain unresolved for decades. In December 2016, more than 3 decades after Timothy's life was taken, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the Spalding County Sheriff's Office decided to reopen the case. Cold case investigator looked at the long-dormant file again, looking more closely at the evidence and stories that had circulated for years. As the investigation progressed, the authorities began to gather fresh witness testimony. Individuals came forward with statements that shed new light on what had happened that October night. Some recalled hearing suspects brag about their involvement, openly admitting to the stabbing. Accounts described the number of stab wounds as being between 28 and 32, closely matching the brutality that had been recorded at the crime scene. Witnesses also recalled details about Timothy being dragged behind a truck and about the motivation behind the attack. Consistently, testimony pointed toward the same cause: Timothy's relationships and socializing across racial lines. These statements gave investigators the evidence they needed to move forward. The reinvestigation eventually led to a wave of arrests. 5 individuals were taken into custody: Lamar Bunn, Sandra Bunn, Gregory Huffman, Frankie Gebhardt, and Bill Moore. Among them, Gebhardt and Moore were directly accused of carrying out the crime itself. The others were charged with offenses related to interfering with the investigation. For the first time, accountability seemed possible. The prosecutors argued that Gebhardt and Moore's anger over Timothy's relationship with Gebhardt's girlfriend was the driving force behind everything. Gebhardt was brought to trial, and on June 26, 2018, a Spalding County jury convicted him on multiple counts, including felony murder, aggravated assault, and concealing a death. His sentence was life in prison plus 30 additional years. Moore, who was Gebhardt's brother-in-law, chose to plead guilty rather than face trial. On August 16, 2018, he admitted to voluntary manslaughter and concealing the death of another. For this, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation, and he was banished from the Griffin Judicial Circuit. Meanwhile, Lamar Bunn, Sandra Bunn, and Gregory Huffman faced charges of obstruction and other lesser crimes, accused of attempting to interfere with the long-overdue investigation. Timothy's brother, Tyrone Coggins, said his death took a heavy toll on the family. He said, "We were shocked. We were like, who would hurt this guy? You know, this was Tim. This was the smooth guy, the guy that never bothered nobody, always helped somebody." His sister, Tisa Coggins, remembers her brother, Tim, as someone who was very sweet and outgoing. She said he was the kind of person who could get along with anybody. His headstone reads, "In loving memory." Timothy Wayne Coggins, gone, but never forgotten.